Welcome. Get comfortable. The story you're about to hear will pull at your heart from the first minute.
The gravel road hadn't changed. That was the first thing Rowan noticed, and it undid him more than he expected it to. The way the ruts still cut the same crooked path through the fields, the way the dust still rose in the same pale gold clouds behind the tires, the way the fence posts leaned at the same tired angles they'd leaned at when he was a boy. Riding shotgun in his father's truck, with his knees pulled up to his chest and a Coke sweating in his hand. 8 years, and the land hadn't bothered to age the way people did. It just sat there, patient and indifferent, waiting for whoever came next. He gripped the steering wheel tighter than he needed to. His knuckles had gone pale somewhere around the county line, and he hadn't noticed until now, till the farmhouse came into view at the top of the rise, white paint gone grey and peeling at the corners, the porch sagging slightly on the left side the way it always had, like the whole house was leaning in to listen to something. Smoke didn't curl from the chimney, nobody waited on the steps. His father was 3 weeks dead and buried in the little cemetery off Route 9, next to a wife who'd left this world 20 years before him, and the house just stood there being a house, indifferent to all of it. Rowan's throat tightened. He told himself it was allergies, the dust kicked up by the tires, the dry summer air pushing in through the half-cracked window. It wasn't. He knew it wasn't. He'd cried plenty already in the lawyer's office when they read the will, in his apartment, back in the city at 2 in the morning with a glass of whiskey he didn't finish, in the shower when no one could hear him. He thought he was done crying. Apparently grief didn't work on a schedule, and it certainly didn't ask permission. He slowed the truck, his father's truck technically, though it had been sitting in a garage 3 states away, collecting dust until the estate lawyer handed him the keys along with a folder full of documents that made his chest ache, just to look at and let it roll the last 100 yards up to the house at a crawl. Like some part of him was hoping the driveway might stretch out forever and postpone whatever came next. That was when he saw the barn door open. He hadn't expected anyone. That was foolish, he knew. Someone had to have been keeping this place from collapsing into the dirt. Someone had to be feeding whatever animals were left, mending whatever fences needed mending. But in his mind, the farm had existed in a kind of suspended emptiness since his father's death, a held breath waiting for Rowan alone to walk into it. He hadn't accounted for another person. He hadn't accounted for a stranger's hands in this soil. The man who stepped out of the barn moved, like he belonged to the land in a way Rowan never had, even as a boy. He didn't hurry. He wiped his palms on a rag hanging from his belt loop, methodical, unbothered, and only then did he lift his head to watch the truck approach, his eyes narrowing slightly against the afternoon sun. He was tall. Taller than Rowan had expected from the vague mentions in his father's occasional letters, the offhand references to the fella who helps out, and built like the work had built him, shoulders wide under a faded flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. Forearms corded with muscle and marked by a long, pale scar that curled like a rope's ghost across one arm. His hair was sandy blonde, thick pushed back from his face, with the kind of carelessness that came from a man who didn't own a comb so much as a habit of running his fingers through it when it got in his eyes. His skin was the deep brown of a man who lived outdoors and had for a long time weathered at the corners of his eyes, and when Rowan finally cut the engine and stepped down from the truck close enough to see the man's eyes properly, he found them a pale, startling green, the color of new leaves before the summer heat burned the softness out of them. Neither man said anything at first. Rowan stood by the open truck door, one hand still resting on the frame as though he might need it to hold himself up, and took in the scene the way you take in a photograph of your own life that someone else had been living in your absence. The barn behind the man looked freshly patched in places, new wood pale against the old grey boards. A tractor sat off to one side, older than Rowan, but clearly cared for, oil, black, and gleaming faintly where the sun hit its curves. Chickens moved somewhere out of sight, their idle clucking, the only sound besides the wind moving through the tall grass at the field's edge. The place was alive. That was the thing that struck him hardest, standing there in his city shoes that were already gathering a fine layer of dust. The place was alive, and he had had nothing to do with keeping it that way. "You must be Rowan." The man's voice was low even, carrying easily across the yard without him needing to raise it. Not unfriendly, not friendly either, just flat, assessing, like a man taking stock of a fence line before deciding whether it would hold. "That's me." Rowan's own voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped thin by the 4-hour drive and the 3 weeks before it. He cleared his throat, tried again. "And you're Asher." The man said it like it should have been obvious, like Rowan should have known, and maybe he should have. Maybe if he'd called more, visited more, asked more about the life his father was living out here alone, he would have known the name of the person who'd apparently spent a decade keeping this place from falling down around his father's ears. Instead, the name landed strange and unfamiliar in his mouth when he repeated it. "Asher, right. My dad mentioned you a few times. That was generous." His father had mentioned Asher maybe half a dozen times in 8 years of infrequent phone calls, always in passing, always folded into some other sentence about the weather or the price of feed. "Asher thinks we should replant the east field. Asher's been a big help since my knee went bad. Asher says hello." Rowan had never asked follow-up questions. He hadn't wanted to know too much about the life continuing on without him, the life he'd chosen to leave. Asher's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, a small, tired tilt at one corner, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Yeah, I imagine he did." There was something underneath the words, something Rowan couldn't quite read yet, a weight he didn't have the context for, not resentment exactly, something quieter and harder to name. The two men stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable, the distance between them still a good 10 feet of hard-packed dirt, neither closing it. "K." Rowan found himself doing the same thing he suspected Asher was doing, cataloguing, comparing, trying to fit the person in front of him into whatever shape he'd built in his mind from scraps of information. He'd pictured someone older, he realized, someone grizzled and grey, an old family friend type, the kind of man who'd known his father since before Rowan was born. Not this, not someone who couldn't have been more than a handful of years older than Rowan himself, 35 or 36 maybe, standing there with the unbothered solidity of a man who'd never once doubted his own competence, who looked at the world through pale green eyes that gave away nothing. "Been a long drive," Asher said finally, glancing past Rowan toward the truck, its bed still cluttered with the 2 suitcases and single cardboard box that constituted the entirety of what Rowan had brought with him. Not much to show for 32 years, he thought distantly. Not much to show for choosing a different life than the one waiting here. 4 hours. Rowan shut the truck door, the sound loud and final, in the quiet yard, and made himself walk closer, made himself close some of that distance, even though every instinct told him to stay in the truck, to turn around, to drive the 4 hours back to the city and let the lawyers sort out whatever needed sorting, without him having to stand in this yard and feel the full weight of everything he hadn't done for his father while the man was alive. "Longer than I remembered. It being things get longer when you don't want to arrive," Asher said, and it wasn't unkind. But it landed like a small stone dropped into still water, rippling out further than its size should have allowed. Rowan looked up at him sharply, but there was nothing accusatory in the other man's face, just a flat, plain honesty, the kind of thing a man said because it was true, and he saw no reason to dress it up. "Something like that," Rowan admitted, because there didn't seem to be much point in pretending otherwise. He glanced past Asher toward the house, the porch, the window that had been his childhood bedroom, now dark and curtained. "Guess you've had a lot more practice arriving here than I have lately." Anyway, something shifted behind Asher's eyes at that, a flicker, quickly banked, like a man deciding not to say the thing that had first come to his tongue. 10 years of practice, he said instead evenly. Give or take 10 years. Rowan let that settle into him, let himself really feel the shape of it. 10 years was longer than most marriages lasted. 10 years was longer than Rowan had lived in any single apartment in the city. 10 years was an entire decade in which this stranger had woken up before dawn on land that belonged to Rowan's family, had fed the animals and mended the fences and kept the whole fragile enterprise from collapsing, while Rowan built a life 200 miles away that had, if he was honest with himself, very little room in it for thoughts of home. That's a long time to keep another man's farm running. Wasn't running it for another man. Asher's voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen, but something in it went taut, like a rope pulled to its limit. Was running it for your dad. There's a difference. Rowan felt the correction like a small blade, precise and clean, and he had no argument to offer against it, because it was true. Whatever Asher had built out here, whatever loyalty or love or simple stubborn habit had kept him tied to this land for a decade, it hadn't been built for Rowan's benefit or with Rowan in mind at all. Rowan was just the accident of blood who'd inherited the result of it. Fair, Rowan said quietly, because it was, and because he didn't have the energy to defend himself against a truth he already half believed about himself. I didn't mean it like, I know how you meant it. Asher's tone gentled, just slightly enough that Rowan caught it even through his own exhaustion. Wasn't trying to jump on you for it. It's just, he stopped, seemed to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say, and let it go instead, his jaw working once before he spoke again. More careful this time. Your dad talked about you, more than you probably think. He kept your picture on the mantel, the one from your college graduation. I think you in that ridiculous gown, looking like you wanted to be anywhere else, a ghost of that almost smile. Again, he was proud of you. Whatever else you might be carrying around about how things were between you two, I figured you should hear that from somebody, since he's not around to say it himself. Rowan hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected kindness. Not really. Not from a stranger standing in a farmyard sizing him up like livestock at auction, and it hit him harder than any accusation could have. His eyes stung, and this time he didn't bother telling himself it was the dust. He looked away out toward the field where the wind moved through grass that needed cutting, and let himself have 3 full seconds of silence to get his breathing back under control before he trusted himself to speak. Thank you, he managed finally, for telling me that, and for. He gestured vaguely at the barn, the tractor, the whole quietly thriving expanse of the place. All of this, whatever it cost you keeping it going, I know it wasn't nothing. Asher shrugged. A small economical movement like the praise embarrassed him in some way. He didn't have practice handling wasn't a chore. It was just what needed doing. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring of keys, on brass and dull steel, the metal polished smooth in places from years of handling, and held it out across the space between them. Rowan crossed the last few feet of dirt to take it, and for a moment their fingers nearly brushed, Asher's hand rough and sun-dark against Rowan's own paler one, and something passed between them in that instant that neither man had language for yet. Not quite recognition, just the faint electric awareness of one stranger's proximity to another, amplified by grief and dust and the enormous silence of the fields around them. Your father wanted you to have this, Asher said, his voice flat, now carefully stripped of whatever softness had crept into it a moment before, like he'd caught himself feeling something and was retreating from it in real time. I just kept it running. Rowan closed his fingers around the keys, felt their small solid weight settle into his palm, looked up at the house that was now, impossibly, his to keep or sell or let fall into ruin, his to decide the fate of his, in a way that felt both entirely wrong and entirely inevitable. Behind him, the truck ticked as its engine cooled. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted its weight against old wood. The wind kept moving through the grass, patient as it had always been, and Rowan stood there in the settling dust of the driveway, holding the keys to his father's whole life, wondering how he was ever going to learn to hold it right. Rowan woke to a house that did not feel like his own. The light came in wrong, too early, too grey, slanting through curtains. His father had probably hung 20 years ago, and never replaced faded floral things that smelled of dust and cedar and some ghost of pipe tobacco that had seeped so deep into the walls it would probably outlast the house itself. Lay there for a long moment in the unfamiliar bed, in the unfamiliar room that had once belonged to a man he'd barely known these last 10 years, and listened to the silence, except it wasn't silence. That was the thing he hadn't expected. The city had taught him that silence meant nothing was happening, that quiet was the absence of life. But here, lying in his father's bed, with his father's ceiling above him, he could hear the low complaint of cattle somewhere across the yard, the metallic clank of something being moved, an engine turning over and catching, and beneath all of it, birds. A whole chorus of them, indifferent to grief, indifferent to inheritance, just doing what birds did at 5 in the morning, whether or not anyone was there to hear it. He sat up, rubbed his face with both hands, and looked at the small clock on the nightstand, 5:47 a.m. He hadn't seen this hour with intention in years, not since the early mornings of some ill-advised relationship, or a red-eye flight for work he no longer even remembered the purpose of. His body ached in that specific way that came from sleeping somewhere unfamiliar, in a bed too firm, under a silence too loud. He dressed in yesterday's clothes because he hadn't thought to unpack anything sensible for farm mornings. Jeans that were too clean, a shirt too soft, sneakers that had never touched dirt rougher than a city sidewalk, and made his way downstairs through a kitchen that still held the outline of his father's life in coffee rings on the counter. Calendar on the wall turned to a month that had already passed. He stood there for a moment, just looking at it, at the small square boxes with his father's cramped handwriting, vet, 10 a.m. Order feed, and felt something twist low in his chest that he didn't have time to examine, because through the window over the sink he could see movement in the far field, a figure already at work against the pale wash of morning. Asher. Of course it was Asher. Rowan didn't know the man well enough yet to be surprised, but some instinct told him this was not a fluke, not a one-time early rising, in observance of yesterday's strange handoff of keys and grief. This was simply what mornings looked like here. This was what had been happening every day for 10 years, while Rowan lived his separate life 200 miles away, building a career his father had never fully understood, drifting further from a home he'd told himself he didn't need. He let himself out the back door into air that still held the cool breeze of night, though the sun was already beginning to insist itself over the tree line, gilding the mist that clung low to the pasture grass. The ground was damp beneath his sneakers, and within a dozen steps he could feel the wet seeping through the fabric, cold and unpleasant, an immediate and humbling reminder that this was not his territory. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Asher didn't look up as Rowan approached, though he must have heard him. The man moved with the kind of ease that came from having done a task 10,000 times, checking a fence line with slow, deliberate hands, testing wire tension, crouching to examine a post. He wore the same kind of clothes as yesterday. Faded and practical, sleeves pushed up over forearms that looked like they'd been carved rather than grown, the pale rope-burn scar catching the early light. "Morning," Rowan said. Because someone had to say something, and the silence between them already felt like it was measuring him. Asher glanced up, gave a short nod. "Sleep all right? Not really?" Rowan meant it as something like a joke, self-deprecating, an offering of vulnerability that might invite the same. Asher only made a small sound of acknowledgement and went back to the fence. Rowan stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the other man work, feeling entirely useless in a way he hadn't felt since he was a teenager, failing at something his father tried to teach him, how to back a trailer, how to gut a fish, how to be the kind of son who belonged here. He looked out at the field stretching toward the horizon, green and gold and endless, dotted with the dark shapes of grazing cattle, and understood with a sudden lurch of vertigo that all of it was his now. Every fence post, every animal, every debt, every decision, every gamble on weather and market prices and the whims of soil that had sustained or starved this land for generations. He didn't know the first thing about any of it. "I should probably learn," he said aloud, mostly to himself. But Asher heard it. "Learn what?" "All of it. This." Rowan gestured vaguely at the fence. The field, the whole sprawling weight of the place. "I don't even know what you're doing right now." Asher straightened, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked at Rowan with an expression that wasn't unkind, but wasn't warm either. Praising, careful, the look of a man deciding how much honesty a situation could bear. "Checking for weak spots before we move the herd to the east pasture. Wire gets brittle this time of year, especially where the old posts are. Last thing you want is cattle wandering onto the county road. Right?" Rowan nodded, like this meant something to him. "It didn't. Not really. Not yet. And you just know all this. Like, in your head? 10 years'll do that." Asher's tone was flat, but there was something underneath it. Something that might have been pride or might have been resentment. Rowan couldn't tell which. Maybe both. "Your dad taught me some of it. Rest I picked up." Rowan looked at him for a moment, at the calm, competent way he stood, in the middle of a field that had swallowed Rowan's entire understanding of himself in under 12 hours, and felt something that was almost envy, almost gratitude, tangled together in a way he didn't have a name for. "I'm going to need help," Rowan said finally, because pretending otherwise felt not just foolish, but dangerous. "I don't know the first thing about running this place. I know computers, I know spreadsheets, I don't know cattle." Asher was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Rowan wondered if he'd offended him somehow, if the admission of ignorance had confirmed some suspicion Asher had been carrying since Rowan's headlights first swept up the driveway yesterday afternoon. But when Asher spoke, his voice was measured, careful, like a man laying out terms rather than offering comfort. "I can keep things running, same as I have been. You want to learn, I'll teach you what I can. But I'm not looking to take orders from someone who doesn't know a heifer from a steer. No offense, meant I've been making the calls out here a long time. That's not going to change just because there's a new name on the deed." The words landed harder than Rowan expected, a small cold shock, like stepping into water colder than anticipated. He felt his spine straighten without meaning to, some old defensive reflex kicking in, the same one that had gotten him through boardrooms and family dinners and every uneasy negotiation of his adult life. "I own this land now," he said, and hated how it sounded, even as it left his mouth stiff, entitled, the voice of a man reciting a fact rather than living it. "I know that." Asher's pale green eyes didn't waver. "Didn't say you didn't. I'm saying I've kept this place alive for 10 years while you were off living somewhere else. And I'm not about to start second-guessing every decision I make because you inherited a piece of paper. You want to learn how things work, I'll teach you. You want to run things different, we can talk about it. But I answer to results, not titles. Never have." There was nothing overtly hostile in the way he said it. No raised voice, no aggression, but there was a bedrock certainty underneath the words that told Rowan this wasn't a negotiating position. It was simply how the man saw the world, unshakable as the fence posts he'd just been testing. "Fair enough," Rowan said, though something in his chest was already tightening, some old family stubbornness rising up despite himself. "But I need to understand the decisions being made. All of them, starting now." 1. Asher studied him a moment, then nodded slowly, like he was recalibrating something in his head. "Fine, we're moving 12 head to the east pasture today, soon as I finish the fence line. Grass is better over there, and the west field needs a rest before it's stripped bare. Why not just supplement feed instead of moving them? Wouldn't that be less work?" It was an honest question, born of the 2 farming articles Rowan had frantically read on his phone at 2 in the morning, while lying awake in his father's bed. But he saw immediately from the look on Asher's face that it had landed wrong, sounded less like curiosity and more like challenge. "Supplement feed costs money we don't have to spare right now," Asher said, patience fraying almost imperceptibly at the edges. "Your dad was already behind on 2 payments before he passed. Moving the herd costs nothing but time." "Time's not free either," Rowan said, and immediately regretted the tone of it. Some old boardroom instinct, rising up uninvited, the reflex to counter rather than listen. "If it takes all day to move 12 cows because the fence isn't finished." "Cattle," Asher corrected, low and even, though something had shifted in his jaw. "And it won't take all day if I'm not standing here explaining basic ranch economics to the new owner." The words hit harder than they probably should have, sharp enough that Rowan felt heat rise in his face, an old humiliation reflex from childhood summers spent failing to be the son his father wanted, failing to belong to this land the way Asher so clearly did without even trying. "I'm not trying to make this difficult," Rowan said, working to keep his voice level. "I'm trying to understand what I'm responsible for. That's not the same thing as questioning you for the sake of it." "Feels the same from where I'm standing." They looked at each other across the wet grass, the morning mist starting to burn off between them, and for a moment neither man spoke. Rowan was aware of the sheer physical difference between them. Asher's solid, sun-worn bulk against his own leaner, softer frame, a decade of hard outdoor labor written into the older man's body in a way that made Rowan feel suddenly uncomfortably aware of his own softness, his own uselessness in this particular arena. However competent he might be in the world he'd left behind. "Look," Rowan said finally, forcing his voice into something calmer, something closer to reasonable. "I'm not going to pretend I know better than you about cattle or fences or grass rotation or any of it. I don't. But this is my name on the deed, my father's debts, my decision what happens to this place going forward. I need to be part of these conversations. Not vetoing you at every turn, just informed. Included. Is that so unreasonable?" Asher was quiet again, his gaze drifting briefly toward the herd grazing in the pale morning light, cattle shifting and lowing in that low, contented rumble that seemed to belong to some older, slower version of time. When he looked back at Rowan, some of the hardness had eased from his expression, though not all of it. "No," he admitted, grudging, "it's not unreasonable." "Then can we agree on that much? You keep running things day to day. I'm not fool enough to think I could do it myself right now, but I'm in the room. I know what's happening and why. And if I have questions, they're not accusations. They're just questions." Asher exhaled slowly through his nose, the closest thing to a laugh Rowan had seen from him, yet though it held no real humor in it. "Your dad used to say the same thing. That he just wanted to understand, not interfere." A pause. Then he'd interfere anyway. "I'm not my father," Rowan said, more sharply than he intended, an old wound flaring without warning. Something flickered across Asher's face at that. Surprise, maybe, or something closer to reassessment, like he was seeing Rowan freshly for just a moment. Not as the absent son returned to collect an inheritance, but as a person separate from the man whose ghost still hung over every fence post and every worn tool in the barn. "No," Asher said quietly. "Guess you're not." "Why?" The standoff didn't dissolve so much as simply lose its momentum, the tension between them settling into something less combative, though not yet comfortable, a kind of wary truce forged in wet grass and morning light. two men neither of whom wanted to be the first to look away, and yet neither willing to let the argument curdle into something. Neither of them could walk back from on the first real morning of whatever this arrangement was going to become. "East pasture," Rowan said finally, nodding toward the fence Asher had been working. "Show me. I want to understand why it matters, not just that it does." Asher studied him a moment longer, something unreadable moving behind his pale eyes, and then, without another word, turned and beckoned him toward the fence line, and Rowan followed, his sneakers already soaked through, his understanding of his own life already beginning, however, reluctantly, to reshape itself around the quiet, stubborn rhythms of a place he had never expected to call home. The coffee became the first ritual, though neither of them named it that. Rowan woke on the fourth morning to the smell of it already brewing, dark and bitter and nothing like the oat milk lattes he'd grown used to buying on his way to a job that no longer existed. And he came downstairs to find Asher already at the counter, two mugs set out. Like it had never occurred to him, there might be only one person in the house who wanted coffee at 5 in the morning. Rowan hadn't asked for a mug to be poured for him. Asher hadn't asked if he wanted one. It simply became the shape of the morning, the creak of the stairs, the particular silence of the kitchen before the sun came up, the mug pressed into his hands still too hot to hold properly, and the two of them standing at the window that looked out over the east pasture, not talking, watching the dark peel back from the fields in slow grey increments. By the second week, it had extended itself into something larger. Asher started explaining things without being asked, not lecturing, not the way he'd first shown Rowan the fence line, with that flat, testing patience, but almost absent-mindedly, the way a man might talk to himself if he happened to have company. He'd nod toward the sky, still charcoal-colored, and say something like, "Wind's backing." That means weather's coming in, not going out, and Rowan would file it away without fully understanding it, the way he'd once memorized figures for a client presentation, information without context, until the day he stood beside Asher at the fence post and felt the wind shift against his face and thought, unbidden, backing, and looked up to find clouds stacking on the horizon like Asher had said they would, and something in him had settled into place with a small, private satisfaction he didn't examine too closely. The fence mending took longer to learn than the weather. His hands, which he had always privately thought of as capable, he'd spent a decade typing, gesturing. Holding a coffee cup with elegant uselessness turned out to be almost comically unsuited to the work. He fumbled the fencing pliers the first dozen times, dropped staples into the wet grass, and had to get down on his knees to find them. Once put his palm flat against a section of wire Asher had just tensioned and yelped when it bit into his skin like a blade. Asher, to his credit, didn't laugh, though Rowan caught the corner of his mouth twitching more than once, a restrained thing that made Rowan feel both irritated and strangely pleased, as though he'd earned even that much. "You're choking the pliers," Asher told him one grey Tuesday, reaching over without preamble to adjust Rowan's grip, his calloused hand briefly closing over Rowan's own, warm and rough and startlingly certain. "Let the tool do the work. You're not wrestling it." "Everything out here feels like wrestling," Rowan muttered, but he loosened his grip anyway, and the staple went in clean for the first time, sinking into the post with a satisfying thunk, and he looked up to find Asher watching him with something that might have been approval, might have been amusement, might have been both. "There," Asher said. "Now you're starting to listen to it instead of fighting it." Rowan wanted to ask what it was. The fence, the farm, the land itself. But he didn't, because some part of him understood that Asher meant all of it. The wire, and the weather, and the silence, and the grief that still sat in every room of the farmhouse like an uninvited guest, and that the lesson wasn't really about fences. The dinners came next, and those were quieter still. Rowan had never learned to cook anything beyond the barest competence, reheating, assembling, the kind of city meals that came in containers and required no real participation but Asher cooked the way he did everything else, without ceremony, a big cast-iron pan, and whatever the garden or the freezer offered up. And somewhere in the third week, Rowan found himself standing at the stove beside him, not doing much of anything useful, just being present while onions softened in butter, and Asher moved around him with the ease of a man who had cooked in this kitchen for years and knew exactly where everything lived. "Don't have to stand there," Asher said once, not unkindly. "I know," Rowan said, and didn't move, and Asher didn't push it, and after that it became another unspoken agreement. Rowan in the kitchen while Asher cooked, sometimes talking, more often not, the two of them existing in a proximity that had stopped feeling like tension and started feeling like something closer to comfort. Though Rowan still didn't have a word for what exactly it was becoming. They ate at the long farmhouse table that had surely once sat Rowan's father alone, night after night, for the decade. Rowan hadn't been here, and Rowan tried not to think about that too hard. The image of his father eating in this same silence, in this same house. Growing older and more stubborn and more alone, while Rowan built a life 400 miles away that had, in the end, amounted to very little he could point to now. But some evenings the silence pressed too close for that avoidance to hold, and on one of those evenings, a Thursday, he'd remember later, though he couldn't have said why that detail stayed with him. The rain came down hard against the windows, and the kitchen felt smaller than usual, warmer, lit by the single hanging bulb over the table. And Rowan found the words coming out of him before he'd fully decided to say them. We didn't talk. Me and him. He turned his fork over in the low light, not quite looking at Asher, who had gone still across the table in that particular way he had. Attentive without seeming to try. Not really, not for years. I called sometimes, Christmas, his birthday, whatever, and it was always the same conversation. How's the farm? Fine. How's the city? Fine. Neither of us ever asking the real question, which was probably just asterisk, why did you leave? Asterisk, and asterisk, why haven't you come back? And neither of us wanted to hear the answer badly enough to actually ask it. Asher didn't say anything right away, which Rowan had come to understand was simply how he processed things. Not a withholding, but a kind of care, a refusal to speak before he'd actually turned a thought over fully. The rain filled the space instead, drumming steady against the tin roof of the porch outside, and somewhere farther off, thunder rolled low and unhurried, the kind of storm that announced itself well before it arrived. "He talked about you," Asher said finally. "More than you'd think, for a man who didn't talk much about anything." Rowan looked up at that surprised, something in his chest tightening involuntarily. "What did he say?" "Not much that made sense at the time." Asher's pale eyes were fixed somewhere past Rowan's shoulder, on the window, on the dark and the rain beyond it, like the memory lived out there instead of behind his own eyes. He'd get to talking about the farm, about work that needed doing, and sometimes he'd just say your name in the middle of it. Not to me, exactly, more like he forgot I was standing there. He paused and Rowan waited, not daring to fill the silence in case it stopped whatever was coming. He'd say things like, Rowan would have had this fence fixed twice as fast, or Rowan used to hate this chore. And I never knew what to do with it, because it wasn't really conversation. It was more like he was keeping you here somehow. In the work, like if he kept saying your name over the same jobs you used to do as a kid, it'd bring you back eventually. Rowan's throat had gone tight, and he found he couldn't speak for a moment, staring down at his plate, the food gone forgotten and cooling in front of him. He hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected any of this, the gentleness of it, the specific ache of hearing that his father, that impossible, silent, unreachable man, had apparently spent a decade quietly rehearsing his son's name into the empty fields like a kind of prayer. "He never told me any of that," Rowan said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "He never told me anything. Every time I called, he sounded like he could barely stand to be on the phone with me." Like I was an obligation he was getting through. That was just how he was. Ash's voice had gone quiet, careful. The voice of a man picking his way across ground he wasn't sure would hold his weight. He didn't know how to say things straight, never did. Not the whole time I worked for him. If he was proud of something, he'd complain about it instead, say the hay came in too easy this year, like it was a problem, when really he just didn't have another way to say he was pleased. I figured out pretty quick that with your father, you had to listen for what he wasn't saying. The words themselves usually pointed the wrong direction. That's a hell of a way to live, Rowan said, and he meant it to come out wry, but it landed heavier than that, closer to grief than humor, and Ash's eyes came back to him then, steady and unflinching in a way that made Rowan feel suddenly uncomfortably seen. It was, Asher agreed. Lonely too, I think, for him. He turned his own fork over once, a conscious mirror of Rowan's earlier gesture, and Rowan wondered distantly if that was where he'd learned it, all those weeks of watching Asher's hands over coffee mugs and fence posts. I only saw him cry once. In 10 years. Once. Rowan went very still. Outside, the thunder cracked closer now, no longer distant, and the rain seemed to intensify with it, hammering harder against the windows. But Rowan barely registered it. All his attention narrowed down to Asher's face, to the careful, almost reluctant way he was choosing his next words. Like he'd never planned on saying this out loud, and wasn't entirely sure he should now. When was it? Rowan asked, though some part of him already suspected, already felt the shape of the answer approaching before it arrived, the way you feel a storm in your joints before you see the clouds. The day you left for the city. Asher's voice had dropped lower, quieter, like he was handing over something fragile. I didn't know it was happening, didn't know you were leaving that day. I mean, not until after. I came up to the house in the evening about something. I don't even remember what now. Some question about the equipment. And I found him standing out by the truck. Just standing there. Your bags were gone from the porch, and he was looking down the drive like he expected you to still be visible, even though you must have been gone an hour or better by then. Asher paused, and Rowan realized his own hands had curled into fists on the table, bracing for it. He didn't hear me come up, and when he turned around and saw me there, he didn't even try to hide it. Just stood there, with tears running down his face, right out in the open, like it hadn't even occurred to him that a person might want to hide something. Like that, I'd never seen him cry before. Never saw it again, after, either. But that once I've never forgotten it. Man looked like something had been cut clean out of him, and he didn't know yet how he was going to keep standing upright without it. The kitchen had gone entirely silent, except for the rain, and Rowan found that he was crying too, quietly, without the sobbing heaves he might have expected, just a slow, steady leak of tears he made no effort to wipe away, sitting there at the table with his father's ghost, pressing in close on every side of him, in the walls, in the dishes. On to the man sitting across from him, who had apparently carried this memory alone for a decade, and had never once had reason to hand it over until now. He never told me, Rowan said again, and this time it came out broken, small. He let me think. For 10 years, I thought he didn't care, that I was just some inconvenience. He was glad to be rid of, and the whole time. He stopped, pressed the heel of his hand hard against one eye, furious suddenly, though not at Asher, not even really at his father, but at all the wasted years. The phone calls that could have held something real and instead held only weather and small talk, and the studied avoidance of two men who apparently loved each other exactly as badly and as silently as it was possible to love someone. I don't think he knew how to tell you, Asher said gently. I don't think he had it in him. Some men just don't. Doesn't mean it wasn't there. Rowan looked at him, then really looked at the weathered lines around his pale green eyes, at the sun-browned skin and the thick sandy hair pushed back from his forehead. at the steadiness that had annoyed Rowan so deeply that first soaking morning at the fence line and now felt like the only solid thing in a house full of ghosts. And something in his chest turned over slowly, unfurling into a feeling he didn't have language for yet. Something that sat adjacent to grief, but wasn't only grief. Something warmer and more frightening than that. "Thank you," Rowan said, quiet, "for telling me." Asher held his gaze a moment longer than was strictly necessary, something unreadable passing behind his eyes again, that same reassessing look from the fence line weeks ago, except softer now, less guarded. "Figured you should know," he said simply. "Man like that doesn't get to have the last word be silence. Not if I can help it." The rain kept falling outside, steady and unhurried. Now the storm settling into itself rather than breaking, neither of them moved to clear the table for a long while, content instead to sit there in the low kitchen light, in the wreckage of an old grief, finally given air. Two men who had started the season as strangers, wearing each other's discomfort like ill-fitting coats, and who now, somewhere in the space between a fence lesson and a rain-soaked confession, had begun without either one, intending it to become something neither of them was ready to name, but which neither of them, if either had been asked honestly, would have wanted to walk back from either.